Well, you're all very patient, still sitting here, still apparently awake. My name is Heather Valencia, and in an earlier incarnation, I taught German language and literature at the University of Stirling in Scotland. But for many years, I have been heavily involved with Yiddish, researching Sutzkever and other topics, teaching summer courses, and I have my own Yiddish class in Edinburgh. I also have a book which I had hoped would be ready by now, but is due out on the 6th of December, which is a dual language parallel text edition of a goodly selection of Sutzkever's poems. I also would just like to say I am completely low-tech. There is no screen or nothing on any screen. I'm still really living in the 20th century. Jan asked me to find a topic about Sutzkever in Israel, a gigantic topic, a gigantic aspect of Sutzkever's poetic output indeed. So I decided to look at the theme of nature, the relationship of nature, which of course is so absolutely fundamental to Sutzkever's oeuvre, and see what happened to that when Sutzkever came to Israel after the Holocaust. I haven't translated any of my Yiddish quotations, but they are short ones, so I hope it won't be too much of a problem. Als Ding is verwandlenisch, Benayung. All is change, renewal. That's the only translated one. Wrote the young poet Sutzkever in 1938. And this assertion holds true for the themes and imagery of his poetry throughout the decades. So in this paper, I will consider the role of nature in Sutzkever's post-war poetry. But in order to set this in context, I'd like to briefly discuss his poetic relationship to the natural world in his early work and in the war years. So the sources of his poetic inspiration, as we've heard, were the snowy landscape of his early childhood in Siberia and the woods and hills of Lithuania. In his early work, there is ecstatic fusion of the self with the elements of nature. In the opening poem of his second published book, Valdix, from 1940, he exclaims, Ich seh mein Leib in Weiß von der Berjose. Ich fühl mein Blut in Blähung von der Reus. Inanimate nature responds to the poet with human emotions. Proste Stäuben reden von Vergibschaft, stiller Treu von leichten dicken Gnod. But at the same time, in these poems, the poetic self, the Ich, sets his stamp upon nature. This poem that I've been quoting from ends with the triumphant declaration, Und in Alts ist do der Siemen von mein Spann, the sign of my footstep. This early work is a solipsistic vision in which other human beings hardly feature, and nature is both the source and manifestation of his creativity. Nature remained the mainspring of his poetic oeuvre until the Nazi occupation of Vilna and the horrors of the ghetto and Holocaust. And in the substantial corpus of poetry, though, which emerged during the period 1941 to 45, we see the natural world all but disappearing. The setting and imagery are understandably almost entirely urban. The ghetto predominates. And furthermore, the isolated Ich of his pre-war work, immersed in the timeless beauty of nature, is replaced by a collective we, the mir, the poet struggling together with his fellow Jews against the catastrophe, as we have heard in other papers too. When the natural world outside the ghetto does feature, It's significant that the joyful nature imagery of the earlier poetry is often turned on its head. Nature has become a hostile force. Nature has become a hostile force mirroring the trauma of the times. The grass is schimmel or mold. The tree, previously one of Sutzkever's key images of life, of the life force, deeply rooted in the earth, is now perceived as a matseve, nicht zugeklebt zum Boden. The image of the swamp predominates, and the earth itself, with which he earlier identified himself completely, Ich bin Erd, he had declared in a short poem from Valdix, has become a predator. Schling uns ein, he writes, die zu viel Sicherheit hat uns verscholten. These are despairing lines from the first poem of the cycle, Penimer in Sumpen. The experiences of these years have severed the poet from his earlier ecstatic union with nature. After Sutzkever and his family reached the land of Israel in September 1947, the sense of liberation, of a new homeland and a new beginning, is reflected in his poetry. And one of the major vehicles, markers of this, is the reappearance of nature, which again assumes a central role. I'd like to focus on several aspects of the resurgence of nature. First, the landscape of Israel as a poetic vehicle of renewal and integration. Second, the role played by his experience of Africa in helping him to explore, to find the freedom to explore the sensuality, even the savagery of untamed nature. And finally, I'll briefly consider the questions: how does his nature imagery evolve, and what function do key nature images fulfill in his later work? So Israel. Sutzkever fervently embraced the new natural environment. The opening poem of In Feierwogen, the first book published in Israel, evokes his encounter with the land. This untitled 11-line poem, beginning Wenn ich wollt nicht sein mit dir benannt, if I were not there with you, has been analysed by several critics, notably Ruth Weiss and Justin Cami, but it's worth briefly revisiting. It consists of one extended sentence in the unfulfilled conditional form, exploring what would have been the speaker's fate had he not been able to reach the land of his ancestors. Within that terse form, he evokes the burning heat and volcanic rock of the landscape. Wenn ich wollt nicht brennen mitten Land, vulkanisch Land in Chevle Lede. The two lines in the very centre of the poem are particularly significant for their allusion to the Akede, the near sacrifice of Isaac by his father Abraham, from which the child escapes only by divine inner intervention. Sutzkever writes, Wenn ich wollt dat sind noch mein Akede, nicht mitgeboren mitten Land. By using the term Akede to designate his own escape from death, he consciously identifies himself with the ancestors. And this marks really one of the significant features of his early Israeli period. Throughout this early period, there is a strong focus on features of the landscape which have a particular biblical resonance. This emphasizes his passionate desire to root himself now in the ancient history and landscape of the Jewish people. Wo jeder Steindl is mein Seide, every stone is my grandfather, as he asserts in this opening poem. Thus, for example, in the poem cycle entitled Lieder von Negev, evokes features of the natural landscape which are full of Tanakhic resonance. The sun, reflected in the water of a well near Beersheba, is described as a sneh, the burning bush where Moses perceived the presence of God. Of the pass of scorpions, which God designated as one of the boundaries of the land of the Israelites, Sutzkever writes, "Do bist du beim Warstadt von Gor der Yitzire." And he ends the cycle, Lieder von Negev, with a poem entitled Har Sinai, Mount Sinai, which ends, "Har Sinai, du Haar von der Stillkeit in Wiste, die tritt meine Wackeln zum Wolken, was blendigt. Sie spreit seine Fliegel an Odler. Wer bist du? Mein Nomen? Das Lied nicht geendigt." He ends in brackets. The speaker, overwhelmed by the awesome experience of contemplating the mountain where Moses received the 10 Commandments, is struck dumb. Avrom Noverstern alludes to the rhetorical tone of these poems with Eretz Yisrael themes and to the negative reactions of some contemporary critics. And it can indeed be argued that some of this imagery is rather forced or even tendentious. And I have to say that in my own view, poems which respond to a moment of natural beauty for its own sake can often be more successful poetically. Like, for example, the enchanting Hirschen beim Yamsuf, which we read last night, an evocation of deer coming to the water, coming at evening to drink in the water of the Red Sea, magically leaving their shadows on the shore, then departing as reusige Flecken on the sand. The haunting image at the end of the poem is one of absence and mourning. Es bleiben voll Jammer die Sonnvergang Hirschen in Wasser und lecken die Stillkeit von jene, was sennen nit Homer. This image can, of course, be interpreted as a metaphor for the dead, those who are no more, but the possible symbolism here is subtle and multi-layered and permits, I think, of several readings. However, one could argue that the forced artistry, as Gladstein put it, of some poems which emphasize too overtly the biblical symbolism of the landscape stems from Sutzkever's inevitable inner struggle to find a new poetic voice to express the overwhelming experiences of the new situation. One of the major overwhelming experiences was, of course, the ever-present memory of the Holocaust and the annihilation of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Sutzkever regarded it as his poetic mission to preserve the goldene Kette, the golden chain of Jewish existence, by integrating the Jewish heritage of Eastern Europe and the memory of the victims of the Holocaust within his new life and creativity in Israel. He had defined this moral imperative for himself even before he reached the land of Israel. In a poem, for example, entitled Gesegnish from 1944, he addresses his home, Vilna, vowing, "Ich trog dein Nomen durch der Welt, wie es hat mein weiter Seide getrogen durch ein Midberflamm, der Mishken auf sein Achsel." And this idea of transporting the Jewish heritage into the new land is also echoed in the unforgettable climax of the other poem, which has today been mentioned as well, the poem of leave-taking, Zu Peulen, where the poet sees himself carrying Peretz's tomb on his shoulders into his new life. This idea of continuity and integration of past and present remains a central theme which he addresses in the early Israeli poems by symbolically uniting images of the natural world from different spheres and epochs of his life. In the poem Der Schnee auf den Hermann from 1948, the image of snow, which was so important to him from his early life, is a vehicle for uniting three seminal periods of his life. The snowy peak of Mount Hermon, which he observes in the here and now, transports him back to his magical early childhood in Siberia. Quote, "Wenn bagartelt mit a Zeg, es kommt herein mein Tate, und die Sonne, was blonget in dem Wäldler auf die Scheiben, finkelt in sein Bord, sein Ongeeisigte in Chatte." But he is also reminded of the slaughtered Jews of Lithuania. In what I think is a brilliant Sutzkeverian image, the victims are not lying in the snow. Instead, his imagination pictures them as snowflakes. Jeden, was wie Schneeen chlore, sennen sie gefallen, Stummerheit, a ganzen Winter. Sutzkever in this poem resolves the problem of uniting the three snows by an allusion to Bialik's poem El Hatzipur, Zum Feigele, to the bird, to the little bird. Bialik, in this poem, exiled in Poland, begs a little bird to flee to the longed-for land of Zion and bring him news of it. Sutzkever, in Zion, but longing for his lost home, begs the same little bird to return to Lithuania for him. The last stanza of the poem is Vogel von dem Hermann, was ich hab geschlossen Kantschaft noch in El Hatzipur mit dein harziger Negine. Bring a Schnee, a Kindischen, auf deine Fliegel diene von mein Heim, der ihr wo eim. Wird lieber sein die Landschaft. Ohnem Schnee wird kalt sein in der flammiger Medine. This reference to Bialik's little bird symbolically links the old homeland and the new. The birds bringing snow from his former home will bridge and integrate three geographical, temporal, and emotional spheres: the Siberian childhood, during which he, in his own words, became a poet; the traumatic experience of the Holocaust, both symbolized by the snow from his past, and his present existence, represented by the snow he can see on Mount Hermon. And in the oxymoron of the final line, the symbols of snow and fire are fused, and paradoxically, the snow of his past life represents the warm, life-giving force which demands to be part of the new fiery land. In this way, Der Schnee auf dem Hermon is one of the poems which effectively express the poet's mission of integrating past and present, which permeates the collection in Feierwogen. Birds feature as messengers, in fact, in several poems. Arguably, the most important is the dove, which gains its most complete symbolic expression in the monumental Ode zu der Taube, dated 1954. This magical dove sprang from the feather of an angel's wing in the poet's remote childhood in Siberia, and throughout the 10 sections of the poem it accompanies him through all the stages of his first 40 years, encouraging his creativity at moments of deepest self-doubt. And at the end of the poem, when he's sitting unter a Bäum neben Yamsuf, dispelling his anguished doubts about the possibility of creating art after the Holocaust, he asks the dove, Taibele, bist du dieselbe, die Fliegel nit gro, is das möglich? Soll ich da bauen mein Tempel, wie ich hab gebaut ihn tagtäglich? Soll ich mein zauberdig Lempel zergrinen aufs Nei und zerbläuen? And the dove answers, Bauen und bauen dem Tempel, mit sonnigen Seichel im Bauen. This poem, Ode zu der Taube, was first published in book form as one of 3 sections of the volume of the same name. The other poem cycle in the book, Helfanden by Nacht, is a fascinating development in Sutzkever's return to the imagery of nature. Inspired by his journey to South Africa in 1950, These 42 poems celebrate the power of nature from a perspective which I think is unique in Yiddish poetry. Throughout the cycle, all specifically Jewish allusions are absent, and apart from 2 poems with a strong political and social content, modern urban Africa does not feature in this work. Instead, Sutzkever creates a timeless, mythical, pagan world where human beings, gods, and the untamed elements of nature interact together. The boundaries between magic and reality, history and myth are erased. And human beings, animals, sometimes the gods themselves, are subject to the same natural forces. The poems are pervaded by ecstatic, often terrifying nature imagery, and there's a powerful erotic element. The human being is engaged in a struggle between his fear of the forces of nature and a contrary impulse to submit willingly to their power. Here in these poems, the immediacy of the ecstatic, ich-centered relationship with nature has disappeared. The poetic I has entirely withdrawn. And where an ich appears, it's usually in a legendary, fictitious role, a leper, a hunter, a dying girl, or a young widow. The powerful natural forces he depicts are indifferent to the human struggle. In this vision of untamed nature, a central role is played by the elephant, as you could guess by the title, Helfanden bei Nacht. One of the early poems of the cycle is an origin myth in which the elephant is the primordial creature from whose tusk the first human springs. In another, the trope of metamorphosis is played out in the erotic fantasy of elephants by a river casting off their skin and becoming young women who, quote, schneiden auf das Wasser mit die Brust. I could say a lot more about that poem, but we haven't time. But in the poem I want to mention just the poem Besäulen von Helfanden. Here the elephant exemplifies a creature which lives in complete harmony with the natural cycle of life and death. In this poem, the wise elephants, when they sense that their time of death has come, embark in dignity on the long journey to their destined place. Quote, Keiner bringt sie nit aher. Sie spannen einzig weiß durch weinendicke Wälder, chadoshim Joren, wenn es kommt die Zeit von sehr Sterben. Death and decay are ever present in the cycle of poems, Helfanden bei Nacht. But in contrast to the war years, where death was an unnatural, brutal cutting off of a human life, here death is perceived as part of the natural cycle, the great Stirb und Werde of Goethe's vision, which human beings must strive to accept. And I think this is a key aspect of the liberation of Sutzkever's African experience, which Sutzkever himself called urbreististic and onhebdig, primordial, and onhebdig, a beginning. Indeed, taken together, the 3 parts of the book, Ode zu der Täub, represent a significant turning point. In the prose cycle, Grüner Aquarium, Sutzkever has found a new literary genre which takes a central role in his work from then on. In the poeme Ode zu der Täub is a summing up, a cheshbon hanefesh, and simultaneously a looking forward to a new period of creativity. And Helfanden bei Nacht explores a new, exhilarating experience of awe before the great cycle of untamed nature. Finally, I'd like to briefly consider the question, how does Sutzkever's relationship to nature as a key component of his poetic universe change and develop in his later period. In a seminal essay published in 1983, the translator and critic, the late Mordechai Litvin, gave an illuminating analysis of some key elements of the evolution of Sutzkever's web of key poetic images. He characterizes the development of Sutzkever's poetry in terms of, quote, die geänderte Scheichessen zwischen Eindruck und Ausdruck, dem Strom von Welt zum dichterischen Ich und dem Strom von dem Ich zu der Welt. The first period, from the early work through the experiences of the war years and the formative first years in Israel, is characterized in Litvin's view by Eindruck, where the poet was immersed in the real world around him, drawing its impressions and stimulus into himself and evoking them in his poetry. The poeme Ode zu der Taub signals for Litvin the beginning of a second period. Quote, in ihm wägt als schwerer das Projizieren von dem innerwenigsten Neshome-Bild auf der Welt. Als starker dominiert der Drang zu gewinnen die letztgültige Gleichnis vor der eigenen Tuung, vor ein Bading Bechlal von Dichter. Litvin's thesis is, in my view, borne out particularly by the transformation of Sutzkever's relationship to nature in his work. Even though from the beginning the nature motifs had strong symbolic resonance, but they were rooted in the poet's real experience. From the 1950s on, the images develop what Litvin has called neue originelle Kristallisaties und organische Verbindungen. Sutzkever gradually divorces the images from their normal identity in the real world and infuses them with their own poetic meaning. They become almost absolute metaphors, autotelic images, which exist purely as themselves in Sutzkever's poetic world. Sutzkever himself indicated a little of how this process begins. Speaking in a 1959 lecture about the genesis of the 1948 poem cycle A Brief zu die Großen, he describes a letztgebliebene Fläum, was ich hab bemerkt in a Sod, ergets in Galil. Die Fläum is gewen abgepickt von a hungrigen Rob, und es hat sich heraus entpleckt ihr blischendicker Joder. Gleich wie ich hab es der Sehn, seinen angelaufen in mir Klangen, Assoziaties, und die weiter dicke vier Schures. These are 4 lines he quotes of the poem. Die gelle Fläum der Mond an mir allein. Es klappt zwischen beide a zusammendicker Oder. Wieviel soll der Felsenrob nit picken mein Gebein, wird nit können aufsiegeln mein blischendicken Joder. Sutzkever builds here and elsewhere, or everywhere, on a real-life encounter with nature and invests it with symbolic resonance. This fruit kernel imagery then becomes one of the striking metapoetic images to develop from then on, experiencing frequent new kristallisaties in Litvin's word. First, a couple of years later, in a poem entitled Poesie, where the plum is overtly identified as a metaphor for poetry, its fragile skin exemplifying the delicate relationship required between poetry and the poet or reader to avoid irrevocable damage. And from there we see the image developing into the later abstract Finklendiker Iker, the glittering essence that is the inviolable kernel buried deep within the human being, a recurrent key image in the later poetry. A further and this is very brief, a further example of the evolution of a nature image is the sea, which first appears in his work in 1947, when he himself encountered its power in life-changing circumstances. The poem Sturm auf die Wasseren by Krete was written on the ship which took him and his wife and daughter to Eretz Yisrael, and depicts a terrifying storm which threatens to engulf their vessel. The poet personifies this storm as the Sturmkönig, who threatens his child. Morgen wird dein Kind spielen sich mit Perl in die Jammen. This real-life, emotionally charged experience, which I think is the first real appearance of the sea as an image in his poetry, sparks the development of the sea as one of his most important images of poetry, in which the perl mentioned in the 1947 poem often feature as a significant element. Die Neshome von Yam ist verstellt für a Perl is the first line of a poem from In Feierwogen. The depths of the sea become a sort of repository for the essence of poetry. In one poem, the poet dives into the sea, and kissing a pearl, he becomes one with his poetic word. He dissolves into it. And the 1969 poem, Be'achris Hayomim, is an apocalyptic vision of a world filled with poetry. Versunkener Scharben in Jam, an Achsanje ver Perl, der Langen wird emmet zerhebt mit die Perl zusammen von Tom im. Und bringen dem Scharben zu Keller und Beudem, zu menschliche Werte und Klangen. So wird geschehen mit der Dichtung, Be'achris Hayomim. The biography of these images can help to illuminate some of their often mysterious emanations in his later poetry. Thus, for example, the zweifüßige Grosen, the two-legged grasses, who come to the aging poet's bedside and bow piously to him, can simply be appreciated by the reader as a delightful invention of Sutzkever's inexhaustible imagination, or one can peel back the layers of their evolution, going right back to a poem from 1936, where the young poet looks at a tiny blade of grass struggling through the snow and wonders at die Greußkeit von der Gräsel. And then the grass almost disappears during the Holocaust to reappear in this letter to the grasses, where the poetic Ich, after proving that he has not lost the ability to feel and therefore to be creative, rejoices by welcoming back the grasses. A guten Abend, Grosen, a guten Abend wieder. And these imagery of grass become more and more divorced from real grass in the field to culminate in the, for example, the sieben Grosen, who can, only they can understand the mysterious Fiedelreus in the often quoted poem Wer wird bleiben, was wird bleiben? Bleiben wird a Fiedelreus, lekovet sich allein. Sieben Grosen von die Grosen wollen sie verstehen. To conclude, Sutzkever's multifaceted oeuvre is unified by a web of key images from the natural world, which are rooted in his experiences in Siberia and Lithuania and the early years in Israel. These images constantly evolve, combine with other images to form surprising new realities. And they are the vehicle of his enduring quest throughout his long poetic life to find what Mordechai Litvin called the letztgültige Gleichnis, the essential, ultimate poetic word. Thank you.